I'm pleased to introduce our two latest program guests. First, Dr. Sege, Robert Sege, double doctor and Ph.D. as a pediatrician at the Floating Hospital for Children at Tufts Medical School. And he's a professor of medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine. He directs the Center for Community Engaged Medicine. Dr. Sege is nationally known for his research on effective health systems approaches that directly address the social determinants of health. He is a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Social Policy in Washington and serves on the boards of the Massachusetts Children's Trust and Prevent Child Abuse America. He has served on the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Child Abuse and Neglect and on its committee on the Injury, Violence, and Poisoning Prevention. He is a graduate of Yale College, received his Ph.D. in biology from MIT and his M.D. from Harvard Medical School. Very unaccomplished. I mean, really, couldn't you come up with? He lives in the Boston area where he and his wife Karen have raised 3 young adult children. And we have Loren McCullough. She is a research associate at the Center for Community Engaged Medicine. Having recently graduated from Boston University, Loren has dedicated her career path to community engagement and equity in developmental medicine. Previously, Loren has worked with the Boston area families as a student intern at Boston Children's Hospital, as well as with the Harvard School of Public Health in order to better understand health needs of Boston residents. During her undergraduate years, Loren designed an independent project to research equity in interactions between teachers and preschool students in private care systems. Her work continues to be motivated by a desire to enforce policy change built on real-world family successes. Loren received her BA in psychology from Boston University, where she graduated summa cum laude with minors in English and Deaf Studies, also an underachiever. So, my pleasure.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. So we're going to end on a note of hope, and we'll talk a little more about what that means. But I want you, if you haven't already, to think about someone you know who had a difficult childhood, or maybe a high ACEs score or something, and is now a thriving adult. Because we're going to use that person as a touchstone for today's conversation. And the point of this is that history is not destiny, and that human beings are complex. And we're going to talk today about some of the factors in addition to trauma and adversity that make us who we are. So we're going to talk about balancing ACEs with hope. Hope, of course, is healthy outcomes from positive experiences. And Laura and I are here representing a big team, well, not so big, medium-sized team in Boston. And they're here in a picture of most of us. And then we have a wonderful staff and a terrific National Advisory Board. And what a National Advisory Board does is what you really want, which is putting it politely, they give us their candid opinions. So they keep us doing things right. So really a delight to be here and talk to you about the results of all these people and the many we've spoken to as we introduce you to hope. And by taking time to learn about hope, you're becoming part of a movement that seeks to change the way professionals who interface with children and families think about the work we do and think about the families who are clients or participants or patients. And in doing this, we promote active engagement and we work hard to avoid perpetuating racist systems. So we'll dive in now. So hope exists because positive experiences help children grow into healthier, more resilient adults. And what we're doing with the Hope Healthy Outcomes from Positive Experience framework is helping ourselves as professionals, as people who work with children and families, better understand and support these key experiences. So if you think about it, most of us spend a lot of time doing risk assessments. Who here has ever done a risk assessment? Okay, who's not paying attention? That's the only 2 options, right? And if you think about it, many of our screening tools codify implicit bias. And we can talk about it endlessly. But if you just think about ACEs, one of the ACEs is having a family member who's incarcerated. So you get an ACE score if that happens. And we know that there's been tremendous mass incarceration of Black men in this country. So it changes things. We do a risk assessment that confuses the effects of racism with other things. And when we do this, and a person comes into some kind of relationship with us as providers, and all we ask them about is domestic violence and abuse and substance use and poverty and hunger and housing insecurity, we create a presumption of deficit. What we do with hope is we shift the narrative. And we do that because we know people are defined by their strengths and stamina. And in implementing hope, we try to create a presumption of strength. So now, if you can raise your hands, either in person or on Zoom, I'm going to read out the 4 possible answers. What do you already know about positive childhood experiences? And I don't know your name, so just feel free. Just put your hands up whenever the right one. Nothing. What are PCEs? Okay, got a couple of answers there. And anybody on Zoom? Okay. A little. I've heard the term before. Great. Okay. Perfect. And how about more than a little, but probably have a lot to learn? Okay. And who here besides Loren is an expert? Loren. Great. And we talk about this because, as we'll talk about, a lot of the work we're doing, and this paper in particular came out in 2019. And Fleety and Anda's paper came out in 1998. So most of us really haven't spent decades thinking about positive childhood experiences, but we have about ACEs. So we developed a positive childhood experiences scale with the invaluable help of Christina Bethel and her colleagues at Johns Hopkins. And we did this by taking the 2015 behavioral risk factor surveillance survey in Wisconsin that already included questions about ACEs. And we added questions about positive childhood experiences to this. And then we were able to correlate that with adult mental health. And there's a whole group that did this in addition to myself and Christina Peter Pecora from Casey Family Programs, Jennifer Jones and Bart Klipka, who are both now Prevent Child Abuse America, and Jeff Lincoln back at the Montana Institute. So here are the questions. As a child, up until the time you were 18, how often did you feel able to talk to your family about feelings? Feel your family stood by you during difficult times? Enjoy participating in community traditions? Feel a sense of belonging in high school? Feel supported by friends? Have at least 2 adults who are not your parents, who took a genuine interest in you? And how often did you feel safe and protected by an adult in your home? For each of these, if you said always or almost always, got a point. You can have 0 to 7 points, and that became the PCE scale. And the results were really astounding, because usually when you do surveys, you see wee little results. And then you hire a statistician and they tell you, oh, those results really matter, which is great. These ones, even I can see the difference. If people had 6 or 7 positive childhood experiences, 87% had good mental health. If they only had 0, 1, or 2, only 51% had good mental health. And here, just for the sake of a presentation, we define good mental health as not having depression or describing yourself as having poor mental health. And we did that in Wisconsin. We're now working across the country. We have 4 more states coming on board, and Utah will be on board next year. As David Corwin always likes to say, Utah's next. So we hope by the end of 2023, we'll have results from the next 4 states and really be able to have more robust results. So here's what happened. We do the PCE score. We think that PCEs, or positive childhood experiences, help children become resilient and have good health outcomes. So I want to just pause there for just a second. And are there any questions? Because this is the basis for what I'm going to talk about. Yes. Yeah. So the question is, how much does it have to do with the research on resilience? And the answer is a bit. And we're about to see that because we're talking about, because this is looking backwards. So this was done on purpose, just like the ACEs study was done, thinking back as an adult to your own childhood. And so we wanted to do was get something that you could really compare to ACEs because they had the same frame. But of course, we don't live our lives backwards, right? We live them forwards. So we'll get into this with resilience. It's like, what do children need to experience to have to become healthy and resilient? And what we came up with are the four building blocks of hope. And the four building blocks of hope are relationships, safe, stable, secure relationships, environments, safe and equitable environments to live, learn, and play at home and in school, engagement, opportunities to be engaged with your family and community, because that's how you develop a sense that you matter. A sense of mattering is so important. And finally, opportunities for emotional growth. And the reason we have all this little families and those little squares there, the big squares, I'm sorry, the families there, is that we don't fill in exactly what to do with each of those. Families come in all different constellations, different numbers of adults, different relationships, multi-generational families, same-sex families, single-parent families, and there's a cultural environment that determines how people do things, plus resources, all those things. So what we're going to do right now is we go through, describe the four building blocks of hope, and then ask people, what does this mean to you? And that's where the richness of this whole approach comes. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to describe the four building blocks of hope, and then Lauren's going to lead a discussion with you about how this relates to the work that you do with families already. So the first building block is relationships with other children and adults through interpersonal activities. And for each and every one of us in this room, our first relationship is with the person who gave birth to us. There we were, kind of looking little stuff all over us, and just born, kind of squished heads for some of us. And there was an adult that just gave birth to us. And then very quickly, there often are other caregivers who help take care of us, maybe a sibling, maybe another parent. And those form the most important fundamental relationships, that early relational health, the relationship between a child, an infant, and the parents and family. So if you think about that, as we grow up, you begin to make peer relationships. So you watch preschoolers, they're playing with each other or biting each other, whatever they do. They're having other relationships. High schoolers need relationships. And all these things are really important. And I already told you, it's not just the peer relationships, but it's relationships with adults. Children need to have one or two, maybe more adults who are not their parents who care about them. The second are safe, equitable, and stable environments for living, playing, and learning at home and in school. And this one is a double-headed building block because on the one side, roof over your head, clothes to wear, heat in the winter, food in your belly, those concrete supports are important. But there's also emotional safety. So a lot of work has been done in the schools about creating a positive school environment where children feel they belong, where school feels like family, not factory. The fourth building block is social, and the third building block, I'm in trouble with counting today, social and civic engagement to develop a sense of belonging and connectedness. And this is how we know we matter. So if you're on a sports team and you don't show up, it's not good. If you're painting a mural, if you're singing in a choir, if you're doing any of the myriad things that kids do, if you don't do your chore in the classroom or at home, you're missed. And all these things create this sense that I matter in the world. The world's a better place because I'm here. And that's a really important thing to develop. And I think that Dr. Jackson and I were talking earlier, one of the things that happened with teenagers during the pandemic, because they didn't really have a chance to matter, because they were kind of the passive recipients of education through through Zoom, I suppose, right? And they weren't doing all the other things that teenagers like to do. And I always mention, anybody like our logos, the little circle and the word hope? Raise your hand if you like them. Okay. Shout out what you think the age of the chief artist was. 13. I had 13. Close. It was 16. So we work with a group from an after-school arts program in Boston called Artistry Humanity, and we contracted with them to make this logo. So it's really fun. And the fourth building block of hope is emotional growth, playing and interacting with peers for self-awareness and self-regulation. And there's a lot of friction, right? You go out and you play, watch kids play in the playground, they have little fights, they spat, all those things. That's called emotional growth, because that's when you learn the other person has a perspective and you can have negotiations or whatever you need to regulate yourself because you don't always win. And that's where emotional growth happens. It also happens when we're out in nature and get a sense of ourselves as being part of a larger thing. So now I'm going to turn it over to Loren, who has a microphone. And just if you guys want to shout out, and I have a microphone too, you can shout out things that you already do when you heard about these building blocks. How did it resonate with what you were doing? And if you're on Zoom, you can unmute yourself or write in the chat box. And Loren, you've done this a couple of times. What sort of things have you heard that organizations are doing just to get people's thinking going?
Absolutely. So often when we talk about relationships, something that comes up is the provider-patient relationship. So the relationship that is being had between the family and their service provider. So policies that state that people who come in need to be asked for their preferred pronouns, their preferred name, what makes them feel comfortable to have an interaction, are policies that build that relationship building block for families. In reference to social and civic engagement, we see a lot of those examples of like the classic community activities such as Boys and Girls Clubs, different activities for teenagers to get involved in where they can volunteer, student governments in schools as a really good way for kids to get the idea that they matter, that they would be missed if they were gone, and that there is something greater than them that they are contributing to. And all those are really positive. So does anyone have any thoughts or examples from their work of things that they've done to build these building blocks, ways that they've seen other people in the field? Yeah, go ahead. Seems like they just need another person to say hello.
I will go out and do that. I have bubbles and I have a lot of really fun things for different ages to be able to connect and do that. And then personally, Girl Scout swim team, making sure that my kids have other adults surrounding them to be able to talk to besides the parents.
Absolutely. That was a really great example of two of the building blocks tied in there as well. That idea of engaged opportunities, also giving the opportunity for new relationships that are beneficial. Anyone else? Yeah, back here.
Environment, I would say, for our organization, providing safe and stable housing for our survivors, as well as emotional growth through our domestic violence counseling center, providing trauma-informed care counseling services to our survivors.
Absolutely. And it's also important to note that services that work toward the emotional growth of parents are also improving emotional growth of children, because all of that behavior is modeled. And what children see is often how they will react to their environment as well. Any other ideas about building the building blocks in your work that you've seen? One more over here, Dr. Sege.
Hi, I know a lot of people in here know I have multiple hats. So one of the hats is as Director of Research for Esperanza United, one of the culturally specific resource centers for gender-based violence. And for this latest cultural specific grant, we built in participatory action research with youth. And that's where youth throughout the country can apply to be a part of a summer program where they choose a topic or issue of concern to them. They take photos to document the problem, develop narratives to describe the problem, and then report back to adults in the community who can have power over their lives to make a change in the issue. And part of that is because of the strong literature on social and civic engagement on youth outcomes.
That's so wonderful. And these are all like really terrific examples. And I think that we do this not because, well, we do it because I think that many of you are already using these building blocks. And what we're trying to do with Hope is create a framework in our minds so we can sort of tick off what is the relationships that this person has? What is their environment like? Do they have opportunities to be engaged? When do they get a chance for emotional growth? And all those things are really important. And what we found is that by having a framework, it gives people in the field a chance to really think these through systematically. And I'm delighted to hear these great examples because what we say at Hope is it's not new. What's new is a framework and a way of thinking about it. So just the way before the ACEs study was done, there weren't a lot of people running around saying, child abuse, great for children. And then they were shocked the child abuse wasn't. But what it did is it gave a framework for connecting childhood experiences to adult health. And we're trying to do the same thing with positive childhood experiences and adult health, but going a step further and saying, what actions can you take? What do you want to find out about a family to help you move along? So we did this, Charlene Harper Brown and I wrote a paper that gave out the 4 building blocks. And then this year, a group in Australia used the building blocks to analyze a prospective study. There was a birth cohort from 2004 that they followed to 2018 and 2019. And every 2 years, they asked them about relationships, environments, and engagement. And then they looked and saw how they were doing as teenagers. Their 2 main outcomes were acquisition of academic skills and mental health. And this is a sample result that there was a reduction in poor mental health. The more positive experiences that children had at each of these points, at age 0 to 1, 2 to 3, 4 to 5, 6 to 7, 8 to 9, and all together from 0 to 11, there was a reduction in poor mental health as an adolescent. So we know from the literature review that we did, and now we know thanks to the Australians looking forward. These are like vitamins. These are the things that children need. And so when we think about it, if you reflect back to the person who you thought about at the beginning of this talk, who had a traumatic childhood, as we're talking, think about, did they have any positive childhood experiences as well? So one of the questions that always comes up is, what about ACEs? I assume everyone here has heard of adverse childhood experiences. If you haven't, Dr. Jackson will run a remedial class. No, just kidding. But there are 10 kinds of ACEs, and Wendy Ellis here talked about how those ACEs grow up from adverse community environments far too often. So this is really valuable information that we have, and we think we've learned a lot. So if you think just about kind of the lessons that we've learned from trauma-informed care, besides the obvious, trauma is not good for you, we've learned that children's brains respond to experience. The whole idea of toxic stress shows that their brain changes. We know that birth to 3 and adolescence are sensitive stages in life. We know there's a therapeutic importance of childhood experiences. And how do we know it? One of the ways we know it is this is the work we do where we help children who experience trauma heal. And so we all believe it's possible. And most adults at this point understand why childhood experiences matter. And we know, and the reason I gave you that person to think about is that people can heal even after past trauma. There are a lot of people walking around right now as adults who had trauma as a kid, but are doing okay, right? So we think positive childhood experiences are part of that. And just being a scientist, we think that, and Carl Bell said this, the reason that risk factors are not predictive factors is because of protective factors, right? But what we do as professionals is sometimes we only look at the risk factors. So what we're doing now is looking more deeply. So I told you children's brains respond to positive experiences. Just want to tell you, in the 20th century, we thought that the brain was the brain. If you had a stroke and you killed some brain cells, that was it. It's all gone. Now, with intense rehabilitation, we understand that the brain will literally rewire after a stroke, and people can regain significant function through rewiring. We've also, using MRI, taken pictures of people's brains. So when an individual learns how to read, you can see more connections between the visual cortex and the speech area. Neurons that fire together, wire together, the brain actually changes, so that your vision goes right to some little superhighway to the word center, which is pretty wild, to think that our brain changes from practice like that. Similarly, brains change from meditation, and you can see changes in people's brains with intensive meditation education. Okay, and there's a whole thing called post-traumatic brain growth, which is what happens after trauma. And now they've done MRIs and shown that there's certain areas of the brain, the parts that are responsible for executive function, that actually grow during post-traumatic brain growth. So how does this all work? First, I mentioned that the brains rewire. This is a really complex wiring diagram. I got it from the internet. A lot of wires going everywhere. This is a picture of the brain showing some of the wiring we have. Each of us has 1 or 2 billion neurons, and each of those neurons has up to 10,000 connections. I can't do the math very well. There are a lot of possible connections in our brain, and we do rewire, and you can watch people's brains rewire. The second thing is when we talk about ACEs and toxic stress, we talk about cortisol and fear and fight and flight. You guys have all heard of that? Okay. It turns out that there are other things that happen. There's another hormone called oxytocin. I'm sure you all recognize it from the molecular diagram there. Oxytocin is released during intense positive experiences. For example, love. And one of my favorite studies is when you look at a child, when a person gives birth to a child and you look at the non-gestational parent, if they're there in the room, they get a burst of oxytocin too. And I'm going to put it out there, that doesn't make the fathers go into labor or produce breast milk, but it makes them melt. And as a pediatrician who spent time in nurseries, when I learned this, it was so much fun to watch these guys kind of melt with their new babies and think to myself, it's just hormones. So we have a lot that we now know about how brains grow, and adverse experiences and cortisol affect brains, positive childhood experiences, and oxytocin affect brains. So let's look into this. So I told you before that positive childhood experiences promote child development. Now, if you think about these building blocks, child abuse blocks the building block of relationship. Family dysfunction blocks the environment. Children don't feel safe at home. Often, when there's family dysfunction, the concrete resources, food, shelter, all those things get more problematic. And adverse community environments, what Dr. Ellis talks about so much, is it blocks the opportunity for engagement and for that child-centered play. If a neighborhood doesn't feel safe, and parents keep their children safe by keeping them alone in their home, they block those opportunities. So child abuse and neglect disrupt relationships and environments. Family disruption disrupts environments, both emotional and social determinants of health. And adverse community environments reduce engagement and emotional growth. So we think that the reason ACEs are so bad may be because they block those things that we need, those positive childhood experiences. And proof, not really proof, but going along with this, is if we looked at all those Wisconsinites who have 4 or more ACEs, and they really, that's a troubled childhood if you think about it, right? Because there are 3 kinds of abuse, 2 kinds of neglect, 5 kinds of family dysfunction. So you kind of have to tick off a lot of boxes to get there. But if they also had positive childhood experiences, it protected their adult mental health. So if they had 0, 1, or 2 positive childhood experiences, 61% reported depression or poor mental health as an adult. If they had 6 or 7, only 21% reported depression or poor mental health as an adult. So if you think back to the person you were thinking about, they may have suffered from adversity, but if they also had positive childhood experiences, it's similar to other human beings who are complicated. So positive childhood experiences can prevent ACEs. Think about relationships. It can block toxic stress. So if something bad happens to you, you may not develop the brain response called toxic stress, and it can promote healing. And many of us are in these areas, and the examples that you guys gave, they're really examples of how we can change the environment to promote healing, how we can add new relationships to promote healing. So when we put hope into practice, it's strength-based, child-centered, family-led, and we're trying to do it in order to promote access to the 4 building blocks. So we're going to do a real quick exercise, and it's about making a first impression. And parents want to be trusted and valued. And of course, providers, we want to be trusted and valued too. But how do we form these initial impressions? So now we have all the microphones go out. I want you to look at this, and I'm going to use microphones so the Zoom people can hear us. But feel free just to shout out. What risk factors do you see in this cartoon? Does anyone see any risk factors in this cartoon? Smoking.
It's smoking, bugs,
Yeah. Punches in the wall.
holes in the walls.
Yep.
Cleaning chemicals available.
Yep.
Anything else that people are seeing? Mess, just general mess.
Yep. Electric outlet by the baby.
Lack of engagement
Yep.
overall for the family. Anything else that we're seeing? So head height, holes in the wall for children and adults.
Now, how do you think they got there? Okay, so now we're going to change one thing about this cartoon. And the one thing that we're going to change is what's behind your eyes and between your ears. And we're going to ask you is what protective factors do you see?
The family has food.
Parents. Baby has a crib.
There's a dog in the house as well.
Mother sitting in the room with the children.
Togetherness. Come on, speak up.
Housing.
They have electricity. The children have toys.
Cable.
There's furniture, so there's resources. Clothing, yeah. Also notice the young girl has glasses, so there's some sort of medical care. Anything else? Work boots in the corner. And there are cleaning products, so the house is being kept clean.
All right, so now
So.
comes the fun part. Oh, so someone said something over my head. Say it again.
No, it's not clean.
Religion.
Please, all over the house.
So now, raise your hand in person or on Zoom if you found it easier and more natural, I suppose, to see risks in the cartoon. Okay. Great. Okay. And now raise your hand if you found it easier to see protective factors. You're wonderful. Okay. And about the same? Quite a few. Okay. So this is what we find in every group we go to. Most of us find it easier to find risk factors than to find protective factors. And this is a habit of thought. And when we talk about habits of thought, we're going to talk a little bit how our brains work. So that initial thing that you do really quickly, you look at that cartoon, you see risk, there's smoking, there are bugs, there are hazards, right?
Bugs.
That's called type 1 thinking. We're practiced at it. We do it all the time professionally. So it's something that we just do. And that's okay, right? That's how things work in the world. That's how I get to work in the morning. I don't figure out the route. I just get in the car and then I wake up when I get to my office, right? Not literally, don't worry. But there are a lot of things that we learn that way. Type 2 thinking is what happens when we're presented with a novel situation or a speaker challenges us to find protective factors in a picture that's full of risk, right? And if we do too much type 2 thinking, it's exhausting, right? Go home at the end of the day and say, oh my God, my brain hurts. Because we have to puzzle it out. We can't do type 2 thinking all the time. But there's a bad part to this too, and this is where implicit bias enters. So implicit bias enters because we make snap judgments about people depending on how they look or what they remind us of. At work, we had a new manager. The first day I met her, she told me that I looked just like her ex-husband. I knew this was not going to be a great relationship. But so what we're doing here is whenever we train about hope, we talk about implicit bias and we talk about specific things that we can use the hope framework for that are evidence-based methods of reducing bias. One of them is individuation. So if you ask people about what makes them tick, what are their strengths, what are their stamina, what are their relationships, when did something work well for you? You begin to create a whole person. So they're not just a victim of domestic violence or a person with a troubled child welfare history. There's something else to them. Individuation helps. And the other one is empathy. And when we work with parents and we find out what their hopes and dreams are, that's really, I mean, there's a lot in common between all of us humans. So when we move to the positive side, empathy is much easier to develop. So this goes to the question earlier about resilience and other models. Hope is not new. We're built on a legacy of positivity. There's a science of the positive from the Montana Institute, strengthening families from CSSP, essentials for childhood from the CDC, and Christy Bethel's work on flourishing, pointing out that flourishing is the outcome we want, not just surviving. We've worked with the National Indian Child Welfare Association. They have something called positive Indian parenting. So you can go on, but what hope adds is it takes all these things from a kid's perspective, right? So those are the experiences that a child needs to have. And with strengthening families, you make a stronger family. Children are more likely to have access to these positive experiences. When you do programs like early childhood systems or Help Me Grow, you can provide specific resources for families when they're facing challenges. And then work like the Essentials for Childhood program is doing is helping develop both policies and positive community norms. So whose children are they? They're all of our children. What policies do we need? We need paid parental leave so that parents and kids can bond during those first 6 months of life. So all of those things really matter. It's not just up to the parents. It's up to the way we do things. So each of those programs are related. In my field, oh my God, we have so many names: early relational health, social determinants, child-directed play, parental well-being, but they all are parts of the HOPE framework. So it gives us a way to think about these things as connected, not just individual programs or ideas, but these are ways that children have those 4 building blocks, the positive experiences. And we're 100% convinced that it helps providers because this is a hard field. We see a lot of sadness. And when we begin to see family strengths and hopes and dreams, it helps us too. And it also helps us be more effective because then we can have collaborative problem solving. And we hope it reduces burnout. So I'll come back to you in a couple of years and tell you. But I think about that a lot because if you see somebody and you look at the challenges they've overcome, and then you say to yourself, how the heck did they do that? then you have a sense of curiosity and admiration, and you can begin to talk to them about how to deal with their current challenges. Really different mindset. Sorry, different mindset than if you go in and just list all their problems, right? And we always talk about anti-bias techniques. We have an anti-racism toolbox. We don't think it's the entire answer, but at least we're conscious and trying to reduce the impact of structural racism on the many families in marginalized communities. And so our fundamental belief is that families are resilient and that hope celebrates their strength. So the care model that we talk about is really simple. Identify strengths and sources of stamina, celebrate, honor them, and promote more experiences, more positive childhood experiences. Just 3 steps, pretty easy. And of course, in different fields, we march it out more specifically than that, but identify, celebrate, and promote. And think about how much more impactful that can be than screen and refer. Right? And it's not that families don't need resources. We're complicated. We need everything. All right. So now I'm going to do a true or false. Who thinks that child abuse rose during the pandemic? Okay, a lot of hands. Anybody on Zoom? Okay. Okay, false? Oh, good, smart lady.
True.
Excuse me, I'm not going to give away what I think the answer is. Okay, couple more truths. Okay, so what happened during the pandemic is the risks went up, and I'm not going to go into that. People were stuck at home, their lives were dislocated, but child maltreatment went down. I'm going to show you just a couple of slides really quickly to go through this. We've written a lot about it. First of all, we all know the child abuse reports went down. And the first thing was, of course they went down. It's because schools weren't reporting, because kids weren't in school. That is 100% true. However, in the years prior to the pandemic, schools only filed 20% of all the reports that were received. And abuse reports went down about 50%, in some states more than that. So not going to school wasn't enough. So then we think, well, what are the other ways we can look at this? One way is to look on this graph on the left, looks at admissions for abusive head trauma at 9 major pediatric trauma centers in the United States, 19 pediatric trauma centers. And the average number of monthly abusive head trauma cases that results in hospitalization went from around, the numbers here, went from around 30 to around 18. So dramatic drop in the most serious kind of physical abuse. And the graph on the right, it looks kind of like a squiggle, but what I want you to notice is that in March 2020, all those lines went down. Those are emergency department visits for child abuse. And those are, of course, mostly physical abuse. They went way down. They went down more than you'd expect. And it was a funny thing because people who worked at pediatric centers had the opposite experience. They were seeing more child abuse. But the answer is like Public Health 101. These are population numbers, not what I saw. So if you live in a city where most of the kids get their care at a general hospital or a children's hospital within a general hospital, and all of a sudden the emergency room is filled with adults dying of COVID, all those kids are going to go to pediatric facilities. And so we see those results over and over. If you look at population-based data, child abuse went down. If you look at specialty centers, it may have stayed the same, but in many cases went up. And it's because public health looks at the whole population and there were changes. We also had a lot of fun. We got to survey 9,000 parents. And Loren actually was the manager for this whole program, ran the whole thing, made all the pretty pictures, worked with the statisticians. And what we found was that families grew closer during the pandemic. And the graph in the center, the little Venn diagram, is talks particularly about educating their children. So we asked parents, was it stressful to educate your parents, to educate your children at home? 60% said very stressful, right? And we also asked them, different question, did you and your child grow closer, or was helping your child with their work a positive experience? 60% said yes. Most people who found it very stressful also found it was a positive experience. Again, people are complicated. And if we have time at the end, we're running out of time here. Lauren's doing some qualitative analysis, looking at how parents answered the question, what helped you or what didn't help you during the pandemic. So things like having enough time with your kids is really helpful. And we're working really hard to get the word out. And the reason we're getting the word out is because there's a lesson to learn there. And the lesson is during the pandemic, we as a country lifted millions of children out of poverty with a child tax credit, with stimulus checks, with expanded unemployment insurance, with the CDC's eviction moratorium. We stopped housing insecurity for millions of children. And parents love their kids. And we all know that a lot of child abuse and neglect, not necessarily sexual abuse, but physical abuse and neglect result when families are just super stressed beyond their breaking point. We know how to prevent child abuse. And if we don't claim success when it's right there in our faces, we're not going to learn the lessons we need to learn. Parents love their kids. Parents love their kids. Poor parents love their kids. Rich parents love their kids. And if there's food on the table and housing security, rates of abuse and neglect go down. So with that, and these are on an individual basis and with surveys. Wendy Ellis from Washington, D.C. has done this wonderful project called Resilient Community Environments. And she's called the Resilience. She has a whole network of cities around the country that are building resilient environments for kids. And she's just announced and is rolling out really a step-by-step guide for creating resilient environments for children. It's a wonderful thing. So I could go on and talk forever. What I want to do, though, is leave you with the way to reach us, positiveexperience.org. We have a ton of resources. Many of them are in English or Spanish. If you need any other language, drop us a line. We'll get it for you. But I want to leave you with an image. So I think that all of us as people are a little bit like trees, that we carry the past with us. And ideally, we grow up in multi-generational forests with sunshine, fresh air, access to water and nutrients. But many of us experience trauma, and the trauma can be quite severe and life-threatening. And after trauma, you can see that it's part of the tree, right? And it's get healed over. Look at the branching pattern. Look where there's healing marks where branches used to be. Look where there aren't branches. Trees recover from their trauma. And of course, some trees don't grow up in these natural forests, but they're transplanted and then find a way to thrive in a new environment with enough sunshine and fresh air. If we're lucky, we grow old, and all those experiences that we had through life make us something that is kind of an object of admiration. So I want you to think about how we all carry our own past with us. And when you look around at our patients, clients, participants, colleagues, family, think about all the adversity and positive experiences that make each of us an individual. We're complicated, but there are ways that we can help so that people can recover if they've been traumatized, and we can prevent trauma in the first place. So with that, just want to encourage you. Hope sees people's strengths before the challenges. It builds on current knowledge and practice. The little exercise we did, we asked you what you're already doing. You're already doing this. It's just a different way to think about it. And we hope that you'll adjust your practice and your intake processes and all the things so you can have those 4 building blocks, because we want all of our relationships to be based on respect, not on pity. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to close out this meeting.